82 films, 2 prestigious Oscar statuettes. Robert De Niro could have easily secured his throne among the kings of Hollywood. Yet, it was his own mouth, with its reckless and outrageous political remarks, that shattered everything he had built. An empire collapsed. New films turned into box office disasters. The media tore him apart. His family crumbled. Is this the price he must pay for his actions? Now, at 81, Robert De Niro's career is spiraling into a crisis more alarming than ever before. It started with a single sentence, a jab thrown into the wind on a humid June evening in 2024. Robert De Niro sat in front of a camera. He was recording a message about the presidential election, and what came out of his mouth was a Molotov cocktail lobbed into the political arena. "He's so blatantly stupid," he said, his voice low and gravelly, each word dripping with contempt. "He's a punk, a dog, a pig, a con artist, a mutt who doesn't know what he's talking about. I'd like to punch him in the face." He was talking about Donald Trump, and De Niro didn't hold back. The video hit the internet like a thunderclap, racking up millions of views in hours, shared and reshared by people who saw him as a hero standing up to a bully. Back then, De Niro was untouchable. Goodfellas, The Godfather, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull. He'd built an empire of respect, a career that spanned decades and defined generations. He could say whatever he wanted, and the world would listen. The years rolled on, and De Niro didn't let up. He was on the stage at the Tony Awards, the lights bright, the crowd buzzing with anticipation. He'd been introduced as a legend, a titan of the screen, and he stepped up to the microphone with the swagger of a man who knew his worth. "I'm gonna say one thing," he said, pausing just long enough to let the tension build, his voice steady but charged with defiance. "Fod Trump." The audience exploded, some shocked, some thrilled, many leaping to their feet in a standing ovation. "It's no longer down with Trump," he added, doubling down as the cheers grew louder. "It's fuck Trump." The cameras caught every second, beaming it out to millions, and once again, the internet went wild. He walked off that stage with his head high. That night marked a turning point, not of triumph, but of trouble. He'd been loud about his hatred for the president before, but this time it felt different, sharper. And almost as if the universe heard him and decided to punish him, his life began to crumble right after those words left his mouth. What followed wasn't just a bad week or a rough patch. It was a slow, brutal descent into a nightmare that would strip him of everything he'd built. The first sign of trouble came fast, just weeks after that rally rant, when whispers started circulating in Hollywood. De Niro had spent decades as a titan, a name that could sell tickets on its own, a guy who could walk into a room and make everyone stop talking just to watch him. But now, the air around him was shifting. Studio execs who used to kiss his ring were dodging his calls. His agent, a wiry guy named Paul, who'd been with him since the Raging Bull days, started sounding nervous on the phone. "Bob, it's not personal," Paul said one afternoon in July, his voice crackling through the line as De Niro sat in his New York penthouse, staring out at the skyline. "It's just, the climate's weird right now. People are touchy. That Trump stuff, it's got folks riled up." De Niro gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white, and snapped back, "What, they're mad I told the truth? Let 'em be mad." He hung up, his chest tight with anger, but deep down, a flicker of worry sparked. He'd always been a fighter, but this felt different, like the punches were coming from everywhere, and he couldn't see who was throwing them. That flicker turned into a flame when the Alto night started taking shape, a $45 million gamble that promised to resurrect his fading star with a bold twist. He'd play not one, but 2 mobsters in a single film. The anticipation was electric, a chance for the man who gave us Goodfellas and Casino to prove he still had the fire that once lit up screens across the world, and for Warner Brothers, a studio hungry for a hit, it was a calculated risk worth taking. But as the opening weekend numbers rolled in, the dream shattered with a sickening thud. $3.2 million from 2,651 theaters, a pitiful $1,206 per screen, barely enough to keep the projectors running. The global tally crept to a measly $5 million, leaving a gaping $40 million hole in the budget before marketing cost even entered the equation. And the weight of that failure hit like a crushing blow to a man who'd once been untouchable. This wasn't just a flop. It was a catastrophe, exposing a painful truth. The king of the mobster flick had fallen, and he was falling hard. The first sign of trouble came fast, just weeks after that rally rant, when whispers started circulating in Hollywood. De Niro had spent decades as a titan, a name that could sell tickets on its own, a guy who could walk into a room and make everyone stop talking just to watch him. But now, the air around him was shifting. Studio execs who used to kiss his ring were dodging his calls. His agent, a wiry guy named Paul, who'd been with him since the Raging Bull days, started sounding nervous on the phone. "Bob, it's not personal," Paul said one afternoon in July, his voice crackling through the line as De Niro sat in his New York penthouse, staring out at the skyline. "It's just, the climate's weird right now. People are touchy. That Trump stuff, it's got folks riled up." De Niro gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white, and snapped back. "What? They're mad I told the truth? Let 'em be mad." He hung up, his chest tight with anger, but deep down a flicker of worry sparked. He'd always been a fighter, but this felt different, like the punches were coming from everywhere, and he couldn't see who was throwing them. That flicker turned into a flame when the Alto Nights started taking shape, a $45 million gamble that promised to resurrect his fading star with a bold twist. He'd play not one, but two mobsters in a single film. The anticipation was electric, a chance for the man who gave us Goodfellas and Casino to prove he still had the fire that once lit up screens across the world. And for Warner Brothers, a studio hungry for a hit, it was a calculated risk worth taking. But as the opening weekend numbers rolled in, the dream shattered with a sickening thud. $3.2 million from 2,651 theaters, a pitiful $1,206 per screen, barely enough to keep the projectors running. The global tally crept to a measly $5 million, leaving a gaping $40 million hole in the budget before marketing costs even entered the equation, and the weight of that failure hit like a crushing blow to a man who'd once been untouchable. This wasn't just a flop. It was a catastrophe, exposing a painful truth. The king of the mobster flick had fallen, and he was falling hard. The story of the Alto Nights begins with high hopes. Yet, from the moment the trailers hit, something felt off. There he was, in heavy makeup and prosthetics, growling lines like, "I'm a gangster, that's it, that's the life." But instead of menace, it came across as awkward, almost comical. The online chatter turned brutal. With ex-users joking, it looked like De Niro yelling at his own reflection. The marketing was a mess, too. Barely a whisper on TV. Critics later savaged it, giving it a 38% on Rotten Tomatoes, calling it a tired retread of a genre De Niro had already conquered, while the 70% audience score felt hollow, propped up by a handful of loyalists, dwarfed by the millions who stayed away. The film itself was a misfire, no doubt. That stage had been crumbling for years, ever since De Niro began letting his off-screen rage overshadow his on-screen brilliance. By 2024, his tirades against Donald Trump and his supporters had reached a fever pitch. I'd like to punch him in the face. About Trump, the Alto Nights' failure, instead of retreating to lick his wounds, he doubled down, unleashing a rant to Variety that felt like a scream. I think it's pretty obvious where the know-it-all critics are coming from against our film that focuses on the life of a gangster. It becomes far too obvious that we know now that we are dealing with the MAGA crowd that has one mission in mind, and that is to ruin cinema and to ruin entertainment for others that want to see a great piece of art such as The Alto Nights, which I think was a privilege to be a part of this great film. The words dripped with defiance, but they landed like a plea. And when he added, "It really is all Trump's fault that cinema is dying before our very own eyes," the desperation was palpable. A man clinging to a narrative that absolved him of blame. The backlash was immediate, fierce, and unforgiving. X lit up with scorn, one user writing, "He's blaming Trump for a movie nobody wanted to see," while another said, "De Niro's lost it, and so has his audience." And the sting of those words cut deep, a public rejection that echoed far beyond the MAGA supporters he targeted. That rejection wasn't just noise, it was measurable, a tidal wave of apathy crashing over a man who'd once packed theaters with ease. A YouGov poll in early 2025 showed 62% of Americans now viewed De Niro unfavorably, a steep drop from the 78% who adored him a decade ago. His classics, The Godfather Part 2, Raging Bull, saw streaming viewership plummet 34% since 2020, per a Nielsen report, with fans admitting they couldn't separate the art from the artist anymore. An ex-post summing it up. I hear him call me scum every time I try to watch Goodfellas. This wasn't the first warning sign. His 2024 Netflix series 0 Hour had flopped too, ignored despite his pleas for attention, and producers had begged him to keep politics out of the press tour, a request he ignored, ranting about Trump instead. Now, with the Alto Nights, that pattern of self-sabotage reached its peak, and Warner Bros., already bleeding from a $60 million plus loss on the film once marketing was factored in, had seen enough. They'd cut ties with him months earlier, citing his declining box office draw to The Hollywood Reporter, a decision that felt cold but inevitable after this latest debacle. The contrast was stark. Goodfellas made $47 million in 1990, over $100 million today on a $25 million budget, while The Alto Nights couldn't scrape together a tenth of that. A fall so steep, it left audiences reeling, mourning the loss of a giant who seemed determined to bury himself. That burial felt all the more tragic because De Niro, at 81, couldn't see it coming. He still saw himself as the titan of old, pouring his soul into The Alto Nights, telling Variety, "The Alto Nights is a film that I had to sacrifice a lot of my time to invest in these very complex characters that really deliver the life of a gangster to the big screen." But the reality was harsh. His age showed in every frame, his once sharp edge dulled by time, and the dual role that was meant to dazzle instead felt gimmicky. Critics noting both characters just sounded like De Niro being loud and grumpy. Fans didn't buy it either. Why watch him play two mobsters in 2025 when Casino still held up? A better story told by a younger, hungrier De Niro. The exhaustion was mutual. Audiences were tired of the same old shtick, and Hollywood was tired of his baggage, joining a roster of outspoken stars like George Clooney and Alec Baldwin, whose rants had outpaced their relevance. De Niro's defense of diversity initiatives. What some studios are doing right now because of Trump is also frightening. The fact that they are afraid to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion rang hollow when his own film flopped without any agenda to blame, proving the problem wasn't politics, but him, a man out of step with a world that had moved on. The failure didn't just sting, it bled him dry. The studio lost millions, and they didn't hide their anger. "You're the reason," an exec told him over the phone, voice dripping with blame. "People don't want to see you anymore." He hung up, stunned. He couldn't argue. Ticket sales kept dropping, and within weeks, Alto Nido was pulled from screens, a ghost of a movie no one cared about. He'd begged the producers to take a chance on it, fought for every dollar of that budget, and now it was a flop pinned squarely on him. He stopped going out after that, couldn't face the looks. Pity from friends, smirks from strangers. Friends tried to reach him. Scorsese left voicemails. Pacino sent texts, but he ignored them all. "What's there to say?" he'd mutter, staring at the blank walls. "I'm finished." The king of the mob flick, the man who'd once packed theaters, was now a joke, and the shame of it burned hotter than any anger he'd ever felt. That's when the family trouble hit, and it hit hard. On March 20th, his ex-wife Grace called him, her voice sharp and panicked in a way he hadn't heard since their messiest divorce days. "Bob, the kids are getting letters," she said, and he could hear her pacing on the other end. "Hate mail, threats, stuff about you. They're scared." De Niro's stomach dropped, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. His older kids, Drina, Raphael, the twins, had dealt with fame's downsides before, shrugging off paparazzi and trolls with the toughness he'd taught them. But this was new, uglier. Grace sent him photos of the letters. "Your dad's a traitor. Hope he pays." De Niro's "A dead man walking. Watch your back." One, addressed to his toddler daughter's nanny, was worse. "Tell Bobby his time's up." He stared at the words, his breath shallow, his mind racing. His youngest, just 2 years old, born late in his life to a woman he loved fiercely, was his soft spot, his reason to keep going. Now she was a target too. He called Grace back, his voice hoarse. "I'll fix this," he said, but he didn't know how. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people he'd die for, and they were suffering because of his big mouth. The threats didn't stop at letters. 2 days later, on March 22nd, he got a text from an unknown number. "You should have stayed quiet, Bobby." No name, no trace, just those words glowing on his screen like a warning shot. He stared at it for an hour, his heart pounding, trying to figure out who'd sent it. Was it a random troll, a pissed-off fan, or something worse? Someone with real power, someone who could make good on the threat? He didn't reply, didn't know what to say, but the message stuck with him, burrowing into his thoughts like a splinter. He started checking the locks on his doors twice, then 3 times, glancing over his shoulder every time he left the building. The tough guy from Taxi Driver, the one who'd stared down the world without blinking, was scared, and he hated himself for it. But the fear was real, and it was growing, a shadow he couldn't shake. Hollywood delivered the next punch, and it was a knockout. Warner Brothers, the studio that had backed some of his biggest hits, made a move that left him reeling. He'd been lined up for a major mob boss movie set for 2027, a $20 million paycheck dangling in front of him, a chance to step back into the shoes he'd worn so well in Casino and Goodfellas. It was perfect, a gritty, old-school role that could remind the world why he was a legend. But then the call came. David Zaslav, the CEO, didn't mince words. "We're cutting you," he said, voice cold and final. "You're too risky." Risky? De Niro couldn't believe it. They pointed to his outspoken nature, those fiery rants that had once earned him applause but now made execs nervous. The project was dead, scrapped entirely, $20 million gone in a puff of smoke. He sat in his New York penthouse after that call, his hands clenched into fists. "Foolish," he muttered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "They're fools." He paced the floor for hours, the carpet wearing thin under his steps, replaying the conversation in his head. He threatened to sue, called his lawyers, demanded they fight back, but deep down, he knew it was a losing battle. Warner wasn't stopping there. They pulled him from flashback scenes in Joker 3, a small but meaningful role he'd been excited about, and then axed him from a 2026 action thriller too. One by one, the opportunities slipped away, and the phone that used to ring off the hook went silent. On March 25th, he met Paul at Warner Brothers' LA office. Paul wouldn't look at him, just shuffled papers and cleared his throat. "They're cutting you loose, Bob," he said finally, his voice flat. "Alto Nights tanked, and they're done. No more projects. They're calling it a business decision." De Niro laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made Paul flinch. "A business decision after everything I've done for them?" He leaned forward, his hands gripping the table. "I made them millions, millions, and now I'm trash." This wasn't just a career hit. It was exile, a banishment from the only world he'd ever known. The rejection stung deeper than he'd expected. He'd always been the guy who could bounce back, who'd turn a flop into a comeback. But this time, the doors weren't just closed, they were bolted shut. He called old friends, Scorsese, Pacino, guys he'd bled with on set, and got voicemails or vague excuses. "Busy with a project, Bob," one said. "We'll catch up soon," said another, but the soon never came. He scrolled through industry blogs, seeing his name pop up in headlines like De Niro's Fall, How One Rant Ended a Legend. The comments were brutal. He's a dinosaur. Time to go. Nobody cares about his mobster shtick anymore. He sat there in his hotel room, the curtains drawn, the TV flickering with some late-night talk show he couldn't hear over the noise in his head. He'd given his life to this, nights away from his kids, marriages that crumbled under the weight of his work, a body that ached from years of pushing too hard, and now it was gone. He felt empty, like a house with all the furniture ripped out, and the loneliness hit him like a freight train. Other studios started backing away, too. Universal whispered about dropping him from a family film. Paramount passed on a script he'd pitched. "He's toxic," he overheard someone say at a party, the words cutting deeper than any critic's review. Toxic? Him? The man who'd given the world Travis Bickle and Vito Corleone? He couldn't wrap his head around it. He'd sit in his office, surrounded by awards, Oscars, Golden Globes, plaques from a lifetime of work, and feel like they were mocking him. He didn't want to admit it, but he was scared. Scared that his career, the thing he'd built brick by brick, was slipping through his fingers. The guilt was a weight he couldn't shake, and that guilt grew heavier with every passing day, and then it turned into something unbearable. His grandson Leandro, just 19, bright, funny, a kid with a future ahead of him. But one night the phone rang, and Drina's voice came through, choked with sobs. "He's gone, Dad," she said, barely audible. "Leo's gone." An overdose, pills, they said, found in his apartment, his body cold by the time help arrived. De Niro dropped the phone. The family gathered for the funeral, but he couldn't go. Couldn't face Drina's accusing stare, couldn't stand the whispers. "If I'd been there," he whispered over and over, the words a mantra of regret. "If I hadn't let this take me over." He trailed off, the thought too big, too awful to finish. The press didn't let up. They pounced, splashing the tragedy across every front page. De Niro's neglect blamed for grandson's death. One headline read, bold and merciless. "Family falls apart as actor obsesses," said another. Sources, anonymous of course, claimed he'd ignored Leandro's struggles, too wrapped up in his own battles to notice the kid slipping away. The pain of losing his family was a wound that wouldn't heal. But the world wasn't done with him yet. Public humiliation was waiting, and it hit with a cruelty that left him gasping. In May 2025, he'd been set to receive a leadership award from the National Association of Broadcasters. He'd spent weeks writing a speech, pouring his heart into every line, imagining the applause, the respect. But then the call came, just days before the event. "We're revoking it," the voice on the other end said, flat and unapologetic. "Your comments, your reputation, it's too divisive." He stood there, phone pressed to his ear, the room tilting around him. He stayed there all night, the speech crumpled on the counter above him, the words he'd never say staring down like a cruel joke. By morning, the news was everywhere. X lit up with it, on De Niro, done trending alongside clips of his old rants, twisted into memes that mocked him. Trump? Nah, fuck you, Bobby! One post read, racking up likes by the thousands. He saw it on his laptop. Each comment was a fresh cut, people laughing, calling him washed up, irrelevant. The War Can't Fix, his latest directorial and starring venture, had crashed into theaters like a meteor, only to fizzle out in a cloud of apathy. Released in late 2024, the film, a muddled political drama about a fractured America, grossed a paltry $12.3 million worldwide against a $65 million budget, according to Box Office Mojo. Critics savaged it. Rotten Tomatoes stamped it with a 23% approval rating, with Variety calling it a preachy, incoherent mess that wastes De Niro's gravitas. Audiences stayed away in droves. Its opening weekend pulled in just $4.8 million, a stark contrast to the $55 million debut of The Irishman in 2019, per the numbers. This wasn't just a flop, it was a public execution of De Niro's cinematic credibility. Once, De Niro's name alone could command respect, his presence a guarantee of intensity and depth. From Taxi Driver's brooding Travis Bickle to Goodfellas' icy Jimmy Conway, He built a legacy of 82 films, 2 Oscars, and a box office haul exceeding $5 billion globally, per IMDb data. Directors like Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola turned to him to anchor their masterpieces. But the 21st century has been less kind. Since 2000, his filmography has bloated with duds. Dirty Grandpa 11% on Rotten Tomatoes, The Family 28%, and Grudge Match 31%, each a step further from the artistry of his prime. By 2025, The War Can't Fix wasn't just another misstep, it was the climactic proof of his descent, a film so misguided it couldn't even capitalize on the polarized political climate it aimed to skewer. De Niro's downfall isn't just about box office flops or late-night rants, it's a slow bleed of credibility, a titan undone by his own choices. His obsession with Trump, palpable since 2016, has morphed from righteous indignation into a caricature. "This is a dangerous person, this is a stupid person, and that's a bad combination," he declared on Kimmel, his face etched with fury. Yet, the more he raged, the less he resembled the stoic genius of Heat. Instead, he echoed the unhinged rants of Trump himself, a mirror image of derangement, as he admitted, "I think he has derangement syndrome about us, too." The irony was lost on no one. The numbers paint a grim picture. De Niro's last critical hit, The Irishman, came 6 years ago, a Netflix-backed anomaly in a decade of mediocrity. Since then, his films have averaged a 34% Rotten Tomatoes score, a far cry from the 87% average of his 1970s and 80s output. His box office draw has plummeted. The War Can't Fix's $12.3 million take is a 94% drop from Meet the Parents' $330 million haul in 2000, adjusted for inflation. Studios, once eager to bankroll his passion projects, now hesitate. "He's become a liability," an anonymous studio exec told The Hollywood Reporter in January 2025. "The audience doesn't care anymore. They see him as a relic yelling about politics, not an actor." Compare this to his peers. Al Pacino, at 84, still commands respect with selective roles like The Irishman and House of Gucci. Jack Nicholson, retired since 2010, left on a high note with The Departed. De Niro, at 81, keeps swinging and missing. His Trump fixation, once a rallying cry, now feels like a crutch. "I felt I had to say something about it to go on record," he told Kimmel, justifying his outburst. But what record? One of a faded star shouting into the wind, drowned out by the very man he despises?